thought I'd bring out one of the rifles that I've had for the longest period of time in my collection. This is a Japanese Type 99 from World War II. I've actually had this rifle since before I could drive, because I remember that my brother had to actually take me over to the town where it was advertised from a private seller for me to buy. Bought it for $125 at the time, which actually probably was a little expensive for the rifle, but I've had it for so many years and I've enjoyed it, so it was a well-spent $125. The Type 99 is a typical rifle of the time in that it has a Mauser type extractor on it here for a type of a controlled round feeding. It has some of the features of the Mauser, and then it has some of the other features that are not Mauser-like. Let me just have a look at it here from the back to the front. It has a typical metal butt plate, flat butt plate, which is similar to the later models of the 98K that the Germans had. Side-mounted sling. One of the unusual things about these rifles is the stock. The stock on the back here, if you can see, has two different grains, and it actually has a seam right here. The indigenous wood that the Japanese had available to make their rifles actually had smaller pieces of lumber, so that they ended up actually making the stock in two different pieces, so that they could actually, you know, in the European or American, you would have large lumber that you could get a big piece of wood out of that you could use for a rifle stock and make it a single piece. The Japanese, as you can see here, it's probably about 4.5 inches wide of the lumber that they had, so they actually dovetailed this guy together so that they can make a proper rifle stock out of it. One of the things too about that wood is that I've heard, I haven't actually experienced myself, but I've heard that whenever people refinish this wood is to be careful of the dust, because sometimes it'll actually make a person break out. So I've never had a need to try that out, so I don't know for sure. So anyways, let's look at some of the features. It is, again, a typical rifle of the period, a 24-inch bolt rifle. It has a straight bolt on it, which the Japanese seem to be quite happy with that. It has a very large bolt release here on the side to use to take the bolt out. This particular rifle, you'll hear a lot of times about whether or not a rifle is intact with the mum or not. Now this one, if we can see it, does have an intact mum. However, it has a couple tiny little file marks here outside of the mum. So it could be considered not intact or intact. So I would consider intact, and I would buy the rifle maybe for a slight decrease in value, but I would still consider it an intact mum. This is actually a cherry blossom, I believe a cherry blossom mum on the top there. So again, 24-inch barrel, typical setup with the iron sights on the back. And now atypical, or odd, is actually the sights, the way that they're made, not the position. The position is typical, but the way that they're made is a little bit odd. So if you can see here, it's actually an aperture sight that's mounted ahead of the receiver, which is kind of strange, and it used to cause all kinds of havoc with my eyes because I had to wear prescription glasses. So that is your battle sight there, and that is set for about 300 yards. If you flip up the sight, it's similar kind of to a Mauser, well, maybe not, but it's a ladder sight, sort of maybe similar to the Enfields, or the Enfield Mark IVs are a little bit similar to this, and you can make your range adjustments by moving that up and down. And again, it has an aperture sight there. It does have just a notch sight in there, which I've used already because it was better for my eyes. You can see that I can put my fingernail behind it so you can have a little bit of a contrast. So one of the really strange things about this, though, is these little bars sticking out. Now you might say, what on earth would you put the bars on there for like that? Well, at the time, whenever the Japanese were coming into their power, you know, we were talking just out of the biplane era, and we were still talking like some of the slower fixed gear aircraft, like some of their torpedo bombers and some of our stuff like the old Buffalo, they used to call them, the models, and the early Wildcats and stuff were fairly slow, comparatively speaking. And these are actually anti-aircraft leading gauges, basically. So the soldier would, if there's a airplane flying over, a group of soldiers would flip out their little thing here, and the commanding officer would tell them at which notch that they should lead the rifle at. So they would point their rifle at the aircraft and then guesstimate the range, and was supposed to help them at least put some sort of effective fire on an aircraft as it was passing by. Very dubious as far as the value of that, but that is one of the very strange things about this rifle. Another thing about it is that it actually, some of the models had a monopod on it. And you're familiar most likely with the bipods that we use today for hunting. This was a monopod, which is a wire type arrangement that would fit right here, and then it would fold up and actually go across this portion right here and sort of pinch into the wood. Now I know that this one was never actually had a monopod on it because I don't have the pinch marks up here on the top. I've read some articles on them that said that that actually could help some in steadying the rifle for aim fire. That's debatable. I've heard plus and minus about that. Unlike the Mausers, which had a fixed floor plate, this one actually has a drop floor plate on it, similar to a sporting rifle today. And if you pull back on this, without dropping a hammer, you actually can drop your cartridges out, and you don't have to run them through the action like you do a Mauser. So this is a nice feature. I should say a Mauser 98, typical of German. Now the Argentine ones, they did have a floor plate like that. Now you just heard that I did drop my firing pin. I just out of a little information, I don't have any loaded ammunition for this particular rifle in the house at this point. Some other peculiarities about this rifle goes back to the bolt. The safety, if you look at it here in the back, you take your bolt, run it in, and you want to put your rifle on safety. So, like a Mauser or an Enfield, you don't see any kind of thing for safety. However, the back of the cap on the bolt has a knurled section to it here in the back. So if you push in on it and use your palm to push in on it, as opposed to some people in the past who have said to use your thumb. If you use your thumb like this, you can do it, but it is very tough to do. And a lot of the Americans would criticize the Japanese, in that, it was just a horrible safety, and why would you do such a thing? Well, it wasn't made to do that. You're supposed to use the palm of your hand, go in, push on it, and boom, it's really easy to put the safety on. And it's also a lot quieter than most of the other safeties around in the world at the time. So whenever you want to fire, just push in and go to the side. And you can see here's a little notch too that'll tell the soldier they can feel it at night, or they can actually just visually have a look at it to see whether or not the rifle's on safety. And that locks the bolt and easily taken off. So safety is not a problem unless you're trying to sporterize the thing. But other than that, safety actually is easier to use than the Mauser or the, well, maybe not the Enfields, but the Mauser definitely. Bolt, like I said, is typical sort of-ish Mauser. Has two locking lugs in the front, has sort of a secondary lug here as well, and then also has your vent hole at the front, sort of like a Mauser. And you can see the striker in the back. Now, the disassembly of this bolt is a little bit different than a Mauser. And if you look at this, you actually can take it and sit it on any kind of firm surface, push down on the back again with the palm of your hand. Make sure I'm in there. Yep, you can see it on the palm of your hand. Push in, turn until you feel the thing go to the side, and it just pops right open. It's really easy to take apart. So there's the inside of the bolt shroud on the back, and then your firing pin comes out. And these guys are interesting too, in that this is your firing pin right here. Okay, but you see it's sort of like a barrel, and the spring, instead of like some of the other rifles where the spring is on the outside of the firing pin, the spring is actually on the inside of the firing pin. So I'm not sure the advantages or disadvantages of that, but it is a nice little system, very slick. Interesting that they would come up with the type of design that they did, in that is very different than the European ones. Now, let's see here. It's been a while since I've had this guy apart, so I'm kind of going... There we go. All right, yeah. So anyways, even an old guy who hasn't had his rifle out probably in the last 25 years can take apart and put together his bolt in a few seconds. So you can imagine how easy it would be for a soldier. One of the other things I picked up for this rifle was a bayonet. And this one here is a vet bring back that I bought at an auction. And I believe it's one of the later type that has this straight guard on the back. Very interesting blade. It's a very long blade. I think they're actually 15 inches long. So whenever you attach them onto the rifle, they really reach out there. And the Japanese, I'm told, were taught very well as far as their use of the bayonet. they were very much into swords for a very long time, and bayonets were more of an extension of that, sort of like the Russians using the bayonets all the time on their Mosin Nagants. So this is a typical setup, and just pop it on the front of your rifle. You got a little button back here you push, and there's your bayonet ready to go. Ready for your next bonsai charge, so to say. So, like I said, it's a very long bayonet. From what I've read, they were supposed to be effective as bayonets can be. Now, granted, I've read a lot of articles about whenever the Japanese would, do their suicide attacks. So, take that for what it's worth. A bayonet can be useful if you don't have anything else to use. But doing suicide attacks really just is still doing a suicide attack. Now, as far as ammunition for this rifle, this is a 7.7 Japanese, or I believe it's, let me take a look at my box over here. It's a 7.7 by 58, which is similar in power, they say, the original cartridge, to the British 303. And as well as the 303, it uses a .311 bullet. I used to reload for it. Now, I picked up one box of ammo a long time ago from Norma, fired them off and reloaded them. You can see the back of the box there. It gives you some interesting information as far as the velocity. You can always pause it there and have a look at that for some vintage info from Norma of Sweden that made cartridges for it. You can see there is $19.95, which was extremely expensive. It would probably be like $50 for today. So anyway, I bought one box of those and reloaded them. They're extremely expensive, so I ended up actually also doing a reloading by doing some United States Lake City brass, which is our manufacturer of a lot of our ammunition, especially years ago, and reformed it, cut it down. A really pain in the butt thing to do, but it worked, and I used those cartridges for a long time. Oh, actually, too, going back to the rifle, you might have noticed that it has a sling on it. Okay, well, this is not a typical Japanese sling, and collectors, I'm sure, are taking a look at it and go, hey, that's not a real Japanese sling. Yeah, that's true. What ended up happening back in about 1991 or 92, I didn't have another hunting rifle, so I used to actually use this rifle as a hunting rifle, and I needed a sling. And at that time, the Swedish Mausers were coming in, and the Swedish Mauser sling fit just perfectly on here. So this is just a utilitarian sling from Sweden on a Japanese Mauser. Anyways, back to our cartridges. Did pick up some supposedly original stripper clips for it so that you can use the quicker loading here of 5 rounds at a time into the rifle. Just like as I've said numerous times as the Mausers. But again, going back to this here, did reload for it. Very effective cartridge. The sights were a little hard to see through, but that really wasn't too bad of a problem. And I can see if you can see that there. The front sight, there we go, you can see it. That is one of the spare front sights that I have, and it's triangular. So you have a circle in the back, a aperture in the back, and then, here, I'll show you here. I have a spare aperture sight that I was actually going to modify at one point so that I could use it more effectively in hunting. So you have the triangular front and the aperture back, which I think for maybe 19-year-old eyes that were 20/20 was probably very good. But for 19-year-old eyes and teenager eyes, I should say, for me, and having to wear glasses, they weren't so good. So I was going to actually take this, cut off the top, bought this as a spare. I was going to cut it off in the top and make myself a normal, like a notch and post type sight out of it. Didn't do that, and I'm happy I didn't, because I would rather actually keep this rear sight as a spare maybe for another rifle that I might get in the future. So that is the Japanese rifle, the Type 99. It has been in my collection the longest. What would it be? Probably 35 years, 35 going on 40 years for my little rifle here. It's been a joy just to have and to collect. And if you get a chance to get one, they still aren't very expensive. They've gone up in price more than they used to be, but they are very worthwhile to get. Oh, one other thing here. I can see this blue box sitting over here. Today, you have another choice between the Reform 30-06 brass, the expensive Norma brass. You can actually get, at this time, and I think they go on and off as far as producing it, but PPU from Serbia makes brass, and usually Graf & Sons are carry them. And this actually is the 7.7 by 58 Japanese brass that's made specifically for the Japanese round. And you can get those for a much more reasonable price than anything else in the past. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention real quick is the base of, if you're going to reload for these, the base actually here is just a few thousandths inch wider on the 7.7 Japanese than they are on our 30-06. So whenever you reform the brass and shoot the 30-06, I actually used to keep them fairly underpowered because you would run a risk of bulging here and actually weakening your brass. So just keep that in mind if you're going to reform brass and do it. You're actually better off buying the brass that's properly fit from either Norma, which I'm not sure if they even still produce it. You can still get them on like Gunbroker and stuff from years ago, or try Graf & Sons. So that's the Type 99 Japanese rifle. A great collectible. If you get a chance to buy one, I'd suggest it. And also look into the Type 38, which is 6.5 rifle as well that the Japanese used in World War II. It's been a joy to have it in all these years. And thank you for listening to my videos. Subscribe, please. And out.